I gotta say, don't you just love hearing the little children's voices? Yes, sir. Okay, so we're up to 3 now. We got 2 more. We'll be able to do a Sunday school again. That is a challenge to everybody. Go find me some more kids. It looks like they need to be young ones because we can get a little toddler preschool class going. Okay. I have a story for you. It's a story about darkness and light. When my children were little, Jim's and my children, they weren't that good about picking up their toys before they went to bed at night. And I wasn't that good about making sure they did pick up their toys before they went to bed at night. So quite often over their bedroom floor would be scattered a good number of things, trucks, dolls, Barbie clothes, action figures, depending on which child's room you're in, all, over the floor. And so a lot of times what would happen is in the middle of the night, one of them would cry out in their sleep, and I would go to see what was the matter. And I knew they were kind of half asleep, so I didn't want to just, turn the lights and barge in. I'd try to slip into their room to see what was the matter. And invariably, I would trip over a truck, or in my bare feet, get my foot pierced by a Barbie shoe or an action sword. If you've ever stepped on things like that, it's not real comfortable. And we keep trying to do that. And finally, at some point, it would occur to me that what I really needed to do was just turn on the light. And so I'd turn the light. And once I turned on the light, the trouble that was out there was clear. I could see all the obstacles in the way once I turned on the light. And when I could see what all the obstacles were, I had a choice at that point. I could either step over them or push them out of the way, but I could do something about not hurting myself on them once I turned on the light. I've always thought that the moral of that story just might be something like this: if there is trouble in the darkness, turn on the light. That is what God does for Simeon and for Anna in the story we read from the Gospel of Luke this morning. God turns on the light. Simeon and Anna are old. For most of their adult lives, they've come every single day to the temple to pray. And they've done so because they, along with many others, longed for a time when God would send a Messiah to save the Hebrew people, their people, from the strong arm of the oppressing Roman occupation. Every day they came and prayed up into their old age. And on this particular day, when they were going about just doing what they did every day, it happened to be the day that Mary and Joseph brought the baby Jesus into the temple to observe their religious custom of bringing the firstborn male son to dedicate him to God in the temple and to make an offering of thanksgiving. To most people in the temple that day, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus would not have looked much different from the other poor peasant families, poor peasant Hebrew families who had come to make their own offerings or pilgrimages, to offer their own prayers. But that day when Anna and Simeon saw the baby Jesus, God turned on a light in their minds and hearts. And they saw this baby differently. Both Anna and Simeon somehow knew that through this child, a troubled world would be someday set free. On that day, when God turned on the light for Anna and Simeon, what they saw was hope. What they saw was hope. Yet even at that moment of hope, Simeon also realized that the setting free would not come easily. What Simeon saw when he looked at Jesus, in addition to hope, was also a messy and a painful struggle for the soul of the world. So to Jesus' mother, Mary, Simeon said these words: "This child is destined for the falling and the rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul also." This is what happens when God turns on a light so that we can see the way to freedom. When God turns on the light that will set us free, we are able to see both the hope and the struggle. As we begin the observance of Black History Month, I'm reminded that the attention that we give to the history of the Black experience in this country is one opportunity for God to turn on a light in all of us. As we delve deeper into this part of our common history, a part that's usually either completely ignored in a teaching of history or at best just given as a little footnote in a textbook, as we try to delve deeper into something that is a part of our common history, the lessons that we learn from looking at Black history have the power to bring clarity to many of the troubles we face as a nation today. They're there in the story. One organization which has from its beginning sought such clarity of focus on both the hope and the struggle is an organization known as the Poor People's Campaign. In 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others called for a revolution of values in America. Yes, I said 1968, just in case you thought it was yesterday. A revolution of values in America. To achieve this result, they began to build a broad movement, a movement that crossed the barriers of race, to unite poor communities across America. They called this movement the Poor People's Campaign. Today, the work of the Poor People's Campaign continues. It continues under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II and the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. In a 2018 interview with Judy Woodruff on the PBS NewsHour, Dr. Barber defines the struggle that we continue to face. And he defines it as involving 5 interlocking injustices. Interlocking, like you can't separate. And these are the 5, he says, that interlock: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and the whole concept of militarism, and a false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says you don't really have to address those issues. These 5 are inseparable. And he's not the only one that's noticed this. This has come about from years and years and years of looking, and began in 1968 in a very nascent form. But there's a report that this whole movement published. It's entitled The Soul of Poor Folk. It took an audit of America 50 years after the first movement. As you can expect, it didn't show that much had changed. In fact, it showed that a lot had gotten worse in terms of poverty in America. And in that report, the people who formed it explore and shed more light on how the interconnection of those 5 interlocking injustices work together to keep the darkness of extreme poverty in place. That because they are always working to keep that in place, very few strides can ever be made. In that interview, Woodruff asked him, wasn't that just too much to take on, and what if they just concentrated on one? But his point, and the point of the people that have worked on this with him, is that it isn't just one. It is this one interlocking complex of all of these that work together. And so when we find our favorite cause and just go after it, we're not really addressing the underlying problem. The report goes further to point out that what keeps these 5 interlocking injustices in place is a false narrative. A false narrative which operates as the accepted American cultural narrative. Something that most Americans believe in the story we tell ourselves. And that this false narrative is based on 2 underlying false assumptions. The first is the false assumption that, and I quote, poverty is the fault of the poor. A part of the American narrative is anybody can pull themselves up from their bootstrap if they just work hard enough. And I know some of us in this room, a good number of us in this room, have found that's just not true. That there are those 5 interlocking injustices that make it impossible for some of us to just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. So the first false assumption on which we have been basing an American narrative is that poverty is the fault of the poor. The second false assumption on which we base the American cultural narrative is that despite our nation's abundance, there just is not enough for all of us to survive and thrive. There's not enough. The narrative, the assumption of scarcity. Such scarcity that there isn't enough. And so you better fight for what you have. Whether you have a lot or a little, you better make sure you keep it. You better be afraid of anybody who somebody says might take it from you. You better find something to blame and a group to blame that you're not really a part of. Whether it's just blame the rich or just blame the poor. Either way. These 2 false assumptions, with them in play, American culture has woven this narrative in which systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the religious belief that we shouldn't be fooling with those things, they have been able to thrive and grow. The report debunks these false assumptions. These false assumptions that are foundational to the American cultural narrative. And the report also issues a challenge. It issues a challenge to us that it is time to change the narrative. It is time to change the narrative because we're not going to do anything about the 5 interlocking injustices until we change the assumptions that are false for more honest assumptions. We will treat what we think is the most important thing to treat, as long as we continue that narrative that says we can solve poverty just by the poor helping themselves, or providing programs for them to help themselves, or doing this to help themselves. And we can solve poverty by just realizing that we don't have enough, and survival of the fittest. Until we change that narrative, we cannot effectively deal with the 5 interlocking injustices. So what might a new American cultural narrative look like? That's a question. I imagine that the creation of such a transformed narrative, which is based on more honest assumptions, is destined to be probably one of the major works of this 21st century. It's to go back and re-understand ourselves in a different way. And to paraphrase Simeon's words, I imagine that the presentation of such a transformed narrative will involve the falling and the rising of many in America. Many things, many ideas, many values. It will probably often, as Simeon noticed, be something that is opposed. And the struggle that it takes to transform something as basic as how we understand who we are will certainly reveal the inner thoughts of many, whether we want them to be revealed or not. And yes, there will be times when it will feel like a sword has pierced our own souls also. Because the hope of a world set free does dwell within our willingness to struggle with the narrative of who, as a culture, we understand ourselves to be. And the space in which that understanding will come to light is indeed cluttered with many obstacles. The darkness of not knowing what it is that we'll end up with often allows us to trip over the obstacles in our path. But the maxim still holds true. If there is trouble in the darkness, do what? Turn on the light. Turn on the light. Because God does indeed provide a light. And it's a light which we can turn on by learning from the struggles and the hopes of the past, as well as by taking an honest look at the realities of the present. Like Anna and Simeon, may we continue to faithfully look for this light. And like Anna and Simeon, when the light comes, may we recognize its power to set us free. Amen. Amen.